Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Sorry for the slight delay. So I guess before I get into the lecture part, I wanted to start with a little bit of discussion. I did not get through even half of the journals, so I apologize for that, but this week there's more content for me to comment on. Some of you will get comments. You'll all get comments by probably Thursday. Unfortunately, I teach 2 classes today and also teach tomorrow, so I won't get a lot of time to do grading until Wednesday or Thursday. The ones I did skim through, it looks like most people did the assignment along the way I want. There were a few people that searched in Google Scholar. That was not the intent of this exercise. We're supposed to be going through a conference proceeding or something, not searching for a conference in Google Scholar. We'll talk about searching today, so it's still related, but it didn't quite give you the same experience. So did anyone feel they had any real aha moments as you were going through this? You did? So tell us what you found.
I realized that why you focus, for example, on state of the art models, and then there was some order in the papers. For example, although there wasn't a very clear order, but somehow there was some sort of order, the papers and the same order, in the same area of numbers, were mostly related to each other, had similar kind of topics.
Yes, and that's actually true. Most conferences, if you actually go to the conference, there's a session called Machine Learning in Medical Imaging, Machine Learning in Language, right? So there's a session where they put all the papers together so that people who are interested in that topic go to that session. And in that session, they're in order, right? So, and then it gets a little weird because they have posters which are a broader set of topics and they wander all over. So hopefully you can find that. So that is the way conferences are generally organized. So when you're browsing, especially if you start browsing, right, those sections can be very valuable. Okay, did anyone actually find something that they weren't searching for that they were very happy they found? So tell us about yours.
There were a couple of things that I was not thinking about when I was searching. So my search topic was development, recognition of biological weapons. But I actually found that some of the virus-related different articles that were in-depth study how virus works and bacteria works. So I thought it was very interesting.
Okay, and yours?
Yeah, as I understand earlier this semester that I'm working on MBM, maintain, while I was working in conference, I found some related work the SD and also the IPP, and that was very useful. So now I get a little more thoughts, ideas about maybe what a little bit to my thesis project, not always taking that in, but related to some other work.
Okay. Well, yeah, so it's good. My goal is not to get you to change topics, but when we go in with a particular mindset, we actually call it with blinders on because a long time ago when we had horses, right, you actually put things on the sides of the head of a horse so it wouldn't notice all the things around it because otherwise it gets distracted. It drives better as a carriage horse if you keep its blinders on. But when you're searching, you effectively have blinders on. There were many people who in their comments said, I dismissed this paper because the title or an abstract didn't have any of the keywords I was looking for. But if you're just starting research in a topic, you don't know what keywords you are searching for. You know the ones you think you're searching for, but you don't know what people who are in the field use to describe what's going on. And even if the paper has nothing to do with the keywords you're looking for, in fact, very often one of the most productive ways of doing research is to take an algorithm or an idea from a field that isn't yours and be the first person to import it into your field. Because then it's new and novel to your field. Right? And obviously you can't do that if you don't know what's in those things. So part of the role of browsing is just to keep aware of other things and then be aware, oh, that might be something I could use. So it's a little tricky. But today's and the next assignments, I understand. I start with this one because it's the hardest. And if I start you searching, you'll just keep searching. I wanted you to go through this process and hopefully many of you, most of you, found something useful in your browse that you would not have found by keyword searching. I didn't actually ask you to do that, but if you go back and look at the papers you finally settled on, they might not have the keywords you do. And that's especially important in the beginning of your career where you don't know the lexicon that everyone else is using, right? And I've been in this field a long time, in the fields I'm in, and even now, I still find this. The paper we have that was just accepted for NIPS, 3 days before the conference, I was browsing all of last year's NIPS proceedings to decide did I miss anything? Because we didn't cite anything from 2017 NIPS. It's like, there's hundreds of papers here. One of them's got to be relevant. I got to find something that's relevant. And we'll talk about choosing papers to also make sure you're affecting reviewers. But the people you refer to are likely to be the references of your paper, the reviewers of your paper. So finding somebody who published last year's conference means they're likely to be a reviewer for this year's conference. So you want to find something. And I found a paper that used terms to describe the problem, very much the same problem we're trying to solve. None of our keywords were in that paper. Right? We had to readapt our discussion, which is actually also very important, because if the people in that community are using those terms, we have to at least use those terms and our terms. We can't use just our terms, or they won't recognize the relationship of our paper to theirs. So that's the other really important part of browsing is you might actually find something that's extremely relevant, just not described the way you do it. So we'll talk about when you get ready to submit a paper, doing what I just talked about is a very important thing. Looking through lots of the papers from the last year to make sure you didn't miss one is a part of your browse process. Now by then, you'll be farther in the field, you'll have more terminology of what's going on. So today we're going to talk about, probably three things. Depends on how fast this goes. So I forgot. Were there any other questions or comments people wanted to make? I called on a few and then stopped. Anyone else want to add something to the discussion? Okay. So today we're going to talk about three things. First is identifying a venue. The second will be actually about writing a survey paper, which is your next assignment. So we'll definitely get through that. And then I will start I have two lectures on how to actually write a paper in terms of writing style and writing stories and things like that. Some of which are very non-traditional, so you won't have likely seen them. Some of them are a little bit more traditional. I'll go through both parts of that. So as we go through these today, we'll be going through. I did upload at least two, maybe all three of today's slides into Blackboard, but I was literally still working on my office 5 minutes before class, so I didn't upload them until then. Trying to balance with it. So publishing venues. Okay. So before we get to exactly what venues, we want to talk a little bit about what are you as a scientist, as a professor. Okay. What do you think, if you had to actually describe it in terms of something other than a researcher or professor, what title from another world might actually make sense? Scholar, yeah, that's pretty much the same. So you are about to become a professional writer. Right? You are getting paid, and the primary output of research are documents, published papers, patents, maybe some software, right? But you're being paid to write and do research, but no one cares that you do research if you don't write about it. And so that output is for you to produce papers. Okay, so when we talk about a scientific paper, we want that paper to have value to society. We want people to be reading it. And that's really why we're going to talk about what's the right venues. Okay, so the goal of a scientific paper is to report and publish these results. It can be the first publication of an original research result. That's always one of the things you can be doing. And it's really in a form where the peers of the authors can repeat the experiments and test the conclusions. So the goal is not to just say, here, I did this. It's to say, I did this such that other people can build upon it. They can replicate it, they can do something on top of it. And generally, you want it to be in a journal or a source that is readily available in the scientific community. And we'll get back to this whole balance of readily available and the scientific community. But it's important that people can get access to this and build upon it. But it doesn't mean it has to be freely available. And that we'll go back and through that. So when people talk about what's a scientific paper, part of this will also depend if you sit down and have a conversation with some biology friends. The definition of a paper in biology and computer science are quite different. In biology, conferences really don't mean much of anything. And in computer science, conferences are more important than journals for most people. In some other fields like EE, journals are there, but conferences have some role. And in other fields, journals are the only thing. Conferences are just socializing events. And so you get to figure where they are. Within that, there's going to be a wide range of qualities of venues, which is part we'll be talking about. But in some fields, scientific papers are really to assess observations. In fact, the shortest paper that I know of that was published in a real reputable journal had a title of something like, On Seeing, some Latin name of some fish, in some location in the Polynesian island area, right? And the body of the paper was, we saw it there then. Okay, that's it. So, and there's a photo of the fish, right? It's like, that's the entire paper, right? This fish, right? And to be honest, right, if that fish was like the Ichthyosaurus, which was discovered off of Madagascar, but their paper was much longer, right? The Ichthyosaurus was a fish that people had thought had been extinct for 10,000 years. The first person to see that fish alive, that was a major find, right? Look, it's not extinct. It's been hiding from us, whatever. So in biology, that just an observation can be enough. In the world of computing, there can still be interesting things that are observations of, gee, this network did this. That wasn't expected. In one of my research areas, there was actually, the title of the paper was On Intriguing Properties of Neural Networks. And the paper just showed that networks could be easily fooled in a particular way. That was the intriguing property. An image that looks exactly like me will be recognized by the network as Barack Obama. Okay, that's not what was in the paper. It was like, here it's a school bus, but to the thing it's an ostrich, or here it's a panda bear, but to the neural network it was something else. So it was an intriguing property. Why does it happen? They hazarded some guesses, but those turned out to not be right. But just the fact that they existed was itself an interesting enough paper. That paper has like 900 citations now, and it's from 2014. So 4 or 5 years, it's become a very significant paper. It didn't have a deep theory. It didn't have some wild novel implementation. It was, here's a problem. That alone can sometimes be a great paper. Sometimes in fields, and every now and then in computer science, it's to repeat experiments. So in hard sciences, the first replication experiment is also generally considered publishable. The first person published something. The first person to actually make it work again also can publish it and normally talk about what was different and what the results were and sort of the variations and what goes on. But it has to be a significant enough experiment. But and one of the reasons for that is in a study in high energy physics, something like 17% of the experiments were replicatable. The others that were tried weren't, right? So you couldn't reproduce somebody else's results. Computer science is actually, we've tried to implement dozens of papers in our lab and can't get the same results in the paper. We even have one that we're struggling with now where we have the code from the author's GitHub repository and we can't replicate the results in their paper, right? So replication is sometimes what happened. And one of the reasons that can be very informative is sometimes what the authors said mattered wasn't enough to replicate it. You have to add some extra constraints. And that's often the case. It's like, oh, look, it really matters. If you run this on this kind of hardware, you'll get these results. You run on those kind of hardware, you get those results. That's not very good. Right? There's some problem with that. But if the environmental thing from a biology thing is, oh, and by the way, you have to live in the southern hemisphere to replicate this experiment because the results spin, Coriolis forces are different or whatever. Some weird things can happen. People will also try and use it to evaluate intellectual processes. That is, you can have a paper that is really just a thought experiment. Okay, it happens in computer science, not as often because if we can think about it, we can generally program it, at least simulate it. So we don't have so many pure thought experiments, but in some fields that will occur. In my view, it must have an impact. If everyone who reads the paper says, so what, right, then it has no impact, no one cares, right? And your goal is to actually trying to have as large an impact as you can with a reasonable amount of effort. You don't want to just go for the maximum and miss, so you've got to balance out with this. We'll talk about that. It should be available to the scientific community without restriction. Now, without restriction doesn't mean it's free. It might be behind a paywall. You can get to it when you're in a library. There's a lot of papers you can get to on campus that you can't get off campus unless you go through the VPN or whatever, right? That's an odd part of science, and part of that is one of the goals is that it's not just available, but it's available for a long time. Right? It's actually easy to have your conference proceedings on your website. Okay, not hard at all. You can set up a website, you can put all your papers there and say, here, see, I have my conference proceedings. But if in 7 years somebody else wants to find that paper, are you still maintaining the website? What's the infrastructure, right? So large publishing houses spend a lot of money to maintain their archival infrastructure. Libraries have physical racks and whatever. That used to be a big part of publishing. And when publishers started, almost all of them were in the business of physically making books that you sent to libraries of journals and proceedings. That's all changed electronically, but there's still some cost. Hopefully the cost should come down. It hasn't come down as much as it should. And the open access world will be beating that up, and we'll be playing with that in a bit. But one of the other things that goes on in the scientific community is the review process and the editorial process and a few other things. And so there are some costs that are really being borne by the community. Oddly enough, who sent me the mail? I can't remember now. Somebody sent me a nice little XCD, I think it was. I'll bring it up during break. But, the community rate, I spend, I don't know, I review something in the order of 150 papers a year. If I spend an hour per paper, 2 hours per paper, right? That's 300 hours of my time that I am giving to the community to review all those papers. That's a lot of free labor, right? Especially what I get paid. But it's still like part of what we all do in the community. So there's this question of who's paying for that. I mean, if they don't pay me, mine's all free. But the next level of the editors in a journal or whatever would get paid for that. So, but part of why people want to have these secondary screening services are the indexing and some other processes that come along with it. So if we look at the facets of an academic career, so if you're thinking about being a professor, what fraction of your time is spent on different things? And this is from a survey that was done, I don't have the notes here, but maybe it's in the notes part. But this is like 8 years old, but where do people spend their time? This was a survey of faculty. What fraction of your time do you spend on what things? And about half their time is spent on good papers. Right? It is the dominant thing they do. More important than teaching, mentoring. This is unfortunately from R1 schools where research is far more important than teaching. Time spent on grants, community service, good talks and networking, right? So good papers. Now, good papers includes reading them, but also writing them. So it's a big part of what you're going to do. And if you're really thinking about leaving your legacy on science, what do you want to have when you're gone? What you put in the literature is your legacy, right? I'm not sure that anyone will read any of my papers 50 years from now, but they'll still be in some library someplace, right? But we'll see. So when we start talking about papers, and we're starting that part of writing today, you always want to look at this from a distance. You want to see the paper as the reviewers will see it. And believe me, in general, the reviewers will not see it as the best thing since sliced bread. In almost every venue we are reviewing for, or at least the ones I work on, they're all selective venues. Our goal is not to say, is this paper not so stupid that we can't publish it and be embarrassed? We're asking the question, is this one of the best 25 papers, or best 20 papers, or the best 10 papers in my pile of papers? And so most reviewers read with an extremely critical eye, because we have to filter out the very best of what it is we're reading to get them down there. And so, as I asked you this week to do critical reads, which some of you did and some of you weren't as critical, you're going to have to learn to become far more critical, because that's what it takes to really make it through this process. And before we go too far in this process, it's really important that you understand that the best scientists get their papers rejected or have to make major revisions. There has not been a year where I didn't have more papers rejected than accepted, right? And I'm pretty good at this stuff, right? So more than 50% of my papers are rejected, okay? Now, in some fields, right, that would be actually quite high if you get anywhere near 50% accepted. In some of the best fields, most competitive fields, the best journals have 5-10% acceptance rates. Our best conferences have 20% acceptance rates. Right? So 20, 25, which is the ones I work on. But let's say take science, which is one of the top 2 or 3 journals, right? For science, the rejection rate is exceedingly tough. 75% of the papers are rejected without even getting a thorough review. As an editor, the editor looks at it and says, yeah, this isn't up to our standards. Go away. Now, the good thing is you generally get that in 3 weeks. So you don't wait a long time to find out that the paper's not going to get reviewed. 18% of the papers are rejected. The next fraction, 18% of the total, are rejected after the in-depth review. And then 4% are published in the biological, and around 3% are published in the physical sciences. So a total of 7% of all papers submitted to them ever get published. Okay? And so if you want to be, but that's one of the best publications, right? If you can get a paper in science, lots of people will see it, you'll probably have a big impact on your career. If you're at a top tier school and you don't have, like at Harvard, one of my colleagues was there, if he didn't have a science or a nature paper published, he had almost no chance of getting tenure, right? Because that's their standard, is you need one of those top 2 or 3 publications or you're not playing the game the way they want to play. Now, for your venues, I don't recommend you go for science right away. It's a good goal long term, but you'll still be looking at conferences, and we'll talk about how to find some of that stuff, where you're looking at 30% rejection rate. Well, you got to remember that 30% isn't a random flip of the coin. It's not like if you submit 3 papers, one of them will get in, right? 3 papers will increase your chances because there is some randomness in the process, but it's not that random, and people who have a lot more experience will keep submitting their papers, and then you'll be filling in the bottom part of it. So there's a balance you have to work towards. Okay, so how to choose a venue. The first and most important part about choosing a venue is its fit to your topic. If I submit a paper on computer vision to a conference that doesn't do computer vision, they probably won't accept it. Okay, we've actually, when I was chair of a conference, we actually had a paper that got the top possible scores. 1s was low, low was good for us. 3 1s for its reviews, and all of them argued to reject the paper because they said this is a really good paper, but it has nothing to do with our field, right? So we're going to tell the authors this is really good. Go someplace else, because you know what? We don't actually do stellar, cosmology or whatever the paper was about, right? Yes, there was an image in it, but it really had nothing to do with computer vision. So, and people liked it, but it wasn't, our field, right? So you got to worry about the fit to your topic. That's something you can personally assess. How do you think you assess whether or not it's a fit to your topic? Yeah. You read the other papers and figure out, does that sound out? You want to be a little careful to not project. It's like, oh yes, they're doing this, and that's like what I'm doing here. And to be honest, that might make it is a fit. If you can describe your stuff in their terms and make it sound like the other papers, then maybe it is a good fit. Okay. So that's another good way to assess the fit is something else. What else might be a way to assess, is this conference or venue a good fit for what you're publishing?
People at conference listed in specific topics that is you're interested in, so you can see whether it fits in the topic.
Yeah, so you can look at lists of topics, and if you're playing in a main core topic and it's in that venue as a listed topic, then it probably is. Okay, any other ways?
The title of the conferences themselves say about NIPS, neural information processing systems, or triple AI.
Yeah, that says very little. The list of topics is way more useful than the name of the conference. NIPS has a lot of things that have nothing to do with neural information processing systems, right? They have lots of stuff on reproducing kernel Hilbert spaces and funny math for support vector machines, right? They had lots of papers on that that had nothing to do with the name. But support vector machines were actually in the list of topics. But there's another way, right, that you can help understand if it's a good venue. Anyone else got anything else? Yeah, you should definitely read the call for papers in which they'll generally list the topics and whatever, so that would be, okay. So what about your paper might tell you that it's a good fit about their venue? Well, related work, right? So what about related work?
So if you just have papers that happen to be into that.
Right, so if you're citing papers from that venue, it's probably a relevant venue, right? Maybe, maybe not, right? I can cite a book on algorithms and still not have an algorithm. So you got to understand what that is, but that's the last place to look at. But really, assessing fit is very important. You will waste a lot of your time if you submit to a conference for which they send you back reviews and say, yeah, it's an interesting paper, but it's not a good fit. And that's the end of it. Unfortunately, for many people, the reviewers will actually say, this is a bad paper, because they're reading it from their point of view, and from their point of view, it's not a good fit, but they're also saying it's not a good paper because it's not what we want to do. So you won't even always get good reviews that way. The second thing, and this is a little bit more controversial in terms of how it's distributed across things, and it's highly varied by subject matter, but quality. Okay, the quality of a venue is very important. We're going to talk about tiers of publication, formal ratings in some countries. So very few U.S. institutions have a formal rating system, but in CS. But in College of Business here on campus, right, they have a 3-tier system with these publications are tier 1, these are tier 2, these are tier 3. And for tenure promotion, they need to have a mix of 1s, 2s, and 3s. If you live in certain countries, like in Brazil or in Australia, the Ministry of Education has defined very formal things. In some countries, they have a less formal quality venue, which is like, is it in ISI? If it's not in ISI, it doesn't count, right? Okay, which is an odd one because there's some really bad things in ISI and some really good things that aren't in ISI, but overall, it gives them some metric where they can say, here's a beginning rule. And so understanding the tiers are very field specific. So if you ask somebody who's in, say, natural language, what's the best machine learning conference, you might not get the same answer if you ask somebody who's in core machine learning. Because in fact, the core machine learning is a sub-area, machine learning applied to language is an applications area, right? So in applications, it might be a different conference. One conference might be dominated by theory. So you can get some small ordering changes, but almost everybody agrees, yeah, it's in the top 5. Yeah, maybe it's the 6th one, you get some ordering things. But the acceptance rate is often associated with and sometimes a stand-in for quality. So generally in the top publications of a conference publication, in a conference publication there's a paper that's always a little bit weird if you've seen it, we're like, why is this here? There's a paper called Message from the Chairs or something like that, Program Chairs or Introduction to the Conference. And in here you have a message from the program chairs. And in that, they normally, in almost any good venue, will give you enough information to compute the acceptance rate. They'll say we received 3,393 papers. Of those, we accepted 785, of which 37 were oral, right? And from that, you can compute what was the total number of accepted papers, the ratio to get the total acceptance rate, the oral acceptance rate if you want to look at what those were. And that gives you a pretty good idea. Depending on where you are, different schools, different rules, they'll have some quality. So for example, the minimum publication quality for PhD students in the CS department in the security program is, I think, a venue with less than 40% acceptance rate. Okay, and I'm going to be talking about changing that, but for now, that's what you have to live with. The 40% acceptance rate becomes tricky because not all places are publishing it. So some journals have been saying they have a publication rate, and we'll come back to that later, acceptance rate, where they appear to be fudging it, right? Because how do we know? They just publish what they say it is. It's too easy to cheat. So we're looking at possibly moving some external metrics. But if the venue accepts 80% of the papers, does that mean that there are no good papers there? No. There may actually be still some good papers. Does it mean you don't want to submit there? It depends on what your goal is, but you might want to consider why you want to submit there. And sometimes bad places can actually lead to very good publications because the community there will be very interested. It'll actually be a very good match to your topic. One of my top 3 cited papers appeared in a venue that is so badly ranked you can't even find out its H5 index. Right? No one knows who this conference is. It was a short-lived, it only lasted for about 5 years. But I have a paper there with almost over 300 citations. I don't know what the number is anymore, but right. I published it there because it was, to me, something that was so obvious, but still had practical importance to the operational community that we wanted to talk about it there, right? And then it got lots of citations. So I was like, who cares? But so you don't underestimate, if you have an idea that you think somebody will care about, there's probably a venue for it. And sometimes that venue just isn't a super scholarly venue. That's okay. If the paper eventually gets lots of citations, people will consider it significant. In our tenure criterion and for the department, if a paper gets 20 citations, it doesn't matter what venue it's in. Not counting self-citations. You can't just cite your paper 20 times and move your way forward. But other than that, right, if 20 other people cite your paper, it's had some impact. That's what matters, right? So that's part of what you're looking for is you want your work to influence somebody else. So you're looking for a venue that will help that happen. It can be useful to look at the H5 index in Google, which we showed you how to get to through the metrics. And there's something called the journal impact factor, and which I should actually fix this slide because you want it to be the Reuters-Thompson journal impact factor. There's a couple of fake ones. We'll get to those later. When choosing a venue, it's also very useful to look at the timelines. When is the submission deadline? When will my paper be ready? When will I hear back? When will it be reviewed? Because you actually want to put all these things together and figure out a full plan, which I'll talk about in just the next slide. And then finally, you might also want to look at the other dimensions in terms of the impact. So being a small fish in a big pond, okay, so we'll take your underwater, right? So being an underwater communications paper at the Underwater Communications Conference might seem really great. On the other hand, having that same paper in Infocom might actually have more impact because there's so many more people at Infocom, right? There actually might be more people interested in underwater communications at Infocom than there are at the Underwater Communications Conference. Because if you only get to go to one venue per year because your schools will pay for one trip or you're paying for it out of your pocket, and you as a researcher have to decide what's the best investment of $1,000? going to this thing where I have this broad access to all these other things and there's companies and recruiting opportunities, or going to a smaller, isolated conference? The answer is, it depends on what you're trying to get out of things, and people will go different places. So you have to figure out where you want to go. So there can be other dimensions of the impact. And I will put it out there, many people will also consider, where is the venue? Right? So I had lots more students who wanted to submit to AAAI this year because it's in Hawaii, as opposed to any past years. We've not submitted a paper to AAAI in 10 years, right? But this year we're submitting 2. Now, part of that's also because they asked me to be on the review committee, and they're trying to convince me to be involved. But the Hawaii location made it easier to say, yeah, I wouldn't mind going to Hawaii. My wife will go with me. That'll be fun. But it's not a primary factor. But, okay, so how do you find venues? Well, the first things are pretty obvious. If you want to find the top conferences in some field, Google top conferences and whatever. You will find answers, right? Unfortunately, you'll find lots of answers. Some of them will be more vetted than others. You will find various PhD students in any field. And actually, if you want to get people to know who you are, and you don't find a top conferences in underwater communications, make up a website or a blog post that ranks all the conferences in your field. And if you're the first one to do that and you keep that page up to date, people will start looking at you. Why? Because they're going to Google the same thing you did, right? Looking for top conferences in my field. Whatever's the top ranked Google in that, people will be looking at. And then there's some places that actually have commercial versions of this. Guide to Research, top conferences, will give you a list of the 1,000 top conferences in whatever field you want, or maybe it's 200. I don't remember the answer, but I guess I can actually, it's too much of a bother. You can go in there and you'll see conferences listed. Guide to research.com is incredibly algebraic or formulaic. They rank them by H-index from Google Scholar, which means you can do that too. It's not hard. You just go into Google Scholar and play with it. Their journal rankings are based on Reuter-Thompson Journal Impact Factor, so they also have a pretty good metric for there. So it just makes it easier for you to go look at some of those things and what's going on. Another place to look, especially if you're looking for more esoteric things, or you just want to browse, what are your options? Some of them will you choose, so the top conferences will probably cover tier 1 and tier 2 and maybe tier 3. I think the last time I looked at the top conference list, it was down to an H-index of about 10, which is where I draw the line at the bottom of tier 3. Below that, you're in like who knows what land. Not necessarily bad, just who knows what. Goes on, you have to dig a little deeper. There's a website called WikiCFP, where most people who publish want to get their word out as broad as they can, and so you post it on WikiCFP, which is a place people go to look for venues. So maybe I will go show you that one just so I can show you how it works. And I am not resolving my host. Okay, so you can go in and you can look for various calls for proposals for different conferences. You can actually sign up and get an account, and you'll get notified if any of the keywords that you ask for show up as new conferences. So this can be useful. So you get announced of it. The venues. So there's a bunch of keywords and categories. I don't want to log in because then they'll be very specified. But you can then look at the most recently posted ones, and they're going to show you the name of the event, where it is, when it is, what is the submission deadline. This is useful when you're trying to do the planning. This is the other reason to use it. Even if you know what the top conference is, now you have to find when is their deadline. And of course, you can Google for them and go to their direct web page. Sometimes their direct web page, like the last time I searched for ICML, which is a conference that will occur next June. It's one of the top machine learning conferences. They still didn't have a website yet. I don't know what's up with them, but hey, so sometimes you want to say, so what is their deadline? Is it going to be like November, December, January? You can look up last year's conference, find it, and sort of make some assumptions. This can be a little bit useful. So I've had many students who wanted to travel, and if your visa limits your ability to leave the United States, so you can't leave and come back, then you can search for conferences just from the United States. If you are doing this entirely on your own nickel, and you're trying to find out where's a conference close to me, that's at least somewhat relevant, right? You can do that too. So you can look through this list, and that's much easier. If you don't know the name of the conference, you can just sort of look through and it's like, okay, where are they? There's no good geographic limitations, but oops, no, I'll skip. In there, you can choose keywords and look through various categories. You won't find out anything about the quality of the conference, and unfortunately, lots of the conferences that advertise there are not really good conferences. I'll just go that way. My recommendation is you make and keep a calendar of upcoming papers. You'll in fact walk into various faculty offices and you will see a 4-letter acronym and a date next to it. And I guarantee you, if you see that on their whiteboard, that is their next couple of paper deadlines they're aiming for, or grant deadlines, one of the two, right? But you put them on your blackboard so you see them every day. It's like, that's what my next target is. You're reminded, it is 2 weeks before the deadline. I better get working on this now. It's 4 days before the deadline. I really have to get working on this now. But make your calendar and work out some of your plans. I do say you should search to make sure you're a good fit. So I said start with that. Well, after you've selected it, go check, because just because last year's conference was a good fit doesn't mean this year's conference will be a good fit. Sometimes conferences and venues wander around. It's actually more of an issue for smaller things where their topics can change more quickly. But one thing I didn't mention when we were looking at quality, and this is a trade-off, but almost every one of the really big conferences. So if I look at CVPR, we have, I think, 38 workshops or 52 workshops associated with us. So there's a main conference, and then there's a whole bunch of workshops. The same is true if you go to a big software engineering conference like ICSI or whatever. Like, there's the main core conference, and then there's like 50 or 40 some associated events. If you are looking to interact with the big crowd at a smaller venue, right, you can actually, your chance of getting into a workshop. Some of the workshops will have 70% acceptance rate. They won't get you a high quality publication, but this is the smaller fish in a bigger pond. You might still get more notice for your work than if you have a good paper in a venue. It's very small, very selective, but if you're at a venue with 40 people, how many people really learn about your work? 40 people, right? If you can be in an audience with 150. Unfortunately, some of these workshops at big conferences, I've had lots of people think, this would be great. CVPR had 3,000 people. I'll have 150 people in my audience. No, the biometrics workshop generally had 30. So you're not really doing it to have that big an audience, but you get to go interact with a bigger audience in different ways. So there's a balance there. If you're not sure, or even if you think you are, ask your advisor or ask somebody else to make sure you're a good fit. It's not hard to project. Yes, this work is that. The other part about being a good fit, and this is tricky, I will be bluntly honest with most of my students. Like if they ask me, is this CVPR quality? It'll be like, no, I don't see that you're going to go on that path, right? You just go for WACV or AAAI or one of the slightly easier conferences. Other times it'll be like, could be, so let's try, right? That you need to understand how likely it is it's good enough to get in. And that's something where your advisor will hopefully be able to help you. Read some papers from the venue. You're going to want to do that anyhow. Read what you can about the review process. We'll talk about the reviewing process in 3 or 4 weeks. We'll actually read reviews of some papers and get a chance to look at some of those. So understanding the reviewing process is important because you're going to have to write to that. But for finding a venue, that can also be useful because there are certain venues I personally don't want to submit to because they have what's called an open review process. The paper and all of the reviews will be public. And I don't like the process for reasons that are more political in nature. Oddly enough, it won't hurt me, but I think it's bad for junior faculty to have their papers ripped apart publicly, and then later on other people get to use that information against them. So once your paper gets ripped apart publicly, the next review will probably not be as unbiased because they're going to read that. The first thing to do is they're going to start Googling for related work. They'll find the old review, they'll look at it and say, oh yeah, I agree with that review, I'm done with this, right? Reviewers will sometimes use it against you, and I think it's a bad part of the process. I actually wouldn't mind if they published all the reviews after the papers were accepted and don't show them of the papers that are not accepted, which is what NIPS does. I can live with that. But publishing everything up front is just a bad idea, in my view. But, so most good venues do not allow double submission. So if you're thinking, oh, I'll submit to both of these and I'll go for whichever better one it gets in, they really frown on that. Your paper should have sufficiently different content from any other paper you've submitted. Does that mean they can't have anything in common? No. You can actually submit 2 papers on really the same idea to 2 different venues. If you've applied them differently, you've written them differently, but it can't be substantially the same paper. Okay, part of it is also just copyright law. They can't publish one paper here and one paper here, especially if they're two different publishers, and not violate copyright law. But most of them, if they detect that your paper is a dual submission, and I probably detect 2 a year out of the 150 or so papers I review, two actually, which is really 4, right? Because twice a year, I will detect 2 papers that are dual submissions. And somehow people think, well, I'll just try and get away with it. Well, when they get detected, both papers are rejected. In fact, in our field, we put them on a blacklist, right? Not that we actually blacklist them. They can still submit papers, but their papers will undergo extra scrutiny in the future because they're known to be playing games to try and get around the system. So we'll just make sure we take a little extra look, because it's much easier if I get the paper twice, right? If I get both papers, then I can say it's a dual submission. But that's also a randomized process where papers might not always be assigned to me. So that's why we put them on this list to check carefully, right? And then we just make sure that there's a little bit of checking that things go on.
When you recently a paper that has been previously at an oral conference, let's say that you apply to CVPR, you don't get it accepted.
Oh, absolutely. You submit that. In fact, the plan for submission, most conferences in whatever field, so CVPR, ECCV, ICCV, the top 3 conferences in Vision, time their deadlines so that after rejection from one, you have about 3 weeks to 4 weeks before you submit to the next. Okay. Some conferences like AAAI and NIPS, well, that one they sort of messed up. AAA's deadline was 2 days before the official NIPS announcement, and they actually made a change in their policy that says you can have a dual submission with NIPS, because NIPS has already made their decision. They just haven't published them yet. So we'll give you those 2 extra days. If your paper is accepted by NIPS, it's automatically withdrawn from ours. If it's rejected by NIPS, we'll let your submission continue because we haven't really done much with it. So normally they try and actually plan for a little bit of a gap. So you can actually do this tier 1. You can actually do tier 1, and after 2 or 3 tries at tier 1, maybe it's time to just give up and go to tier 2 or 3. Or you can do tier 1, that didn't work, I'll try tier 2, then I'll try tier 3. It's common for the big conferences like ICSI, CVPR to not only have a deadline such that you can make it to the next big conference, you can also decide on your reviews, I'm going to one of the workshops at this conference. Right? Most of the workshop deadlines are after the decision deadline, so you can work that into the process and say, no, this work is, after those reviews, I can see it's never going to make it in the top tier, so I'm going to go for a workshop and just get it out. Because if you wait another year, maybe the work will have no value because there's 4 other people working on it, and they may have already surpassed you. Or you might have, well, on this part of the state-of-the-art, I'm really close to these 2 state-of-the-art algorithms, but I didn't actually beat them. Right? Well, by next year, it's not going to get any better, right? So either you're going to work on that problem and really advance the state-of-the-art much further, or just get it out now where it still has some value for you to get it out. So those are the kinds of decisions you have to come up with your plan. And it's really a strategizing question. My students and I will spend time sitting around thinking, like, so where's this going to go? What's the fallout if that doesn't happen? Right? Our NIPS paper, which is like, well, if it doesn't get in, we can turn it around and submit to AAAI. If that doesn't work, then we can submit to CVPR. Right? You work through what those plans are. In part because every time you change your submission venue, you have to change your paper. Not just the physical layout, but literally you're changing the story a little bit. And really, you want to incorporate the feedback from reviewers. Right? So that's the other reason. You might feel it doesn't really have a shot for a tier 1 conference, but if there's no tier 2 venue you want to go to in the time window, submitting and getting feedback on your work is also a really valuable thing. So it's worth the effort to go ahead and submit. If the place you really want to submit to is a better venue, then it's a little tricky, because once it's accepted at a weak venue, it is inappropriate to withdraw it and submit it to a better venue. But if it's submitted to a better venue, just one you think you're not likely to get in, you get reviews, that's not necessarily bad. That's the other advantage of double-blind reviewing. It's not publicly embarrassing when you find out your paper was rejected and your name's not on it. Say, hey, so they don't know who you are. So within most fields in computer science, depending on the size of the field, you can do 2 or 3 conferences per year, especially with mixed tiers. You can also always get 3 rounds per year in, right, where it didn't get accepted here, goes into this next round. And that's one of the reasons why conferences are so big in CS. We have lots of them, and they're structured in such a way that it's almost like a continuous publishing cycle. You get the paper in, you get feedback, you revise it, you submit it someplace else, and you keep going. Journals, and I didn't actually put this on the slide, but journals have anywhere between some say 3, but the average is a 6 to 18 month reply process. Right? So you submit a journal paper. Now, conferences often have a 5 to 6 month supply, right? So NIPS decisions came out now. The papers were due in May or March, I forget when, sometime in the spring. CVPR papers are due in in November. Decisions are made in February. So it's 5 months, right? It's not actually a huge difference. But in fact, the time difference can be, because for NIPS, right, we submitted in March, the conference is in December. It's actually a 9 month before the paper is officially out there. So journals at 6 to 9 months are in the same ballpark, but some of them will take much longer. And I will give you a word of caution. When you look at when a journal tells you what is their average time between submission and publication, every journal I know is playing a very bad game in that space. Because what they will do is they will reject your paper and ask you to resubmit it as new, instead of saying so journals have reject, major revision, minor revision, acceptance is. Major revision means you have some work to do, go rewrite it, come back. And many journals are playing the game, they just reject the papers, and then when you resubmit it as new, because it reduces the time to publication date, so they can say, oh look, we on average submit, Journal Machine Learning Research says their average time to acceptance is 9 months. But they also, the average number of times a paper was rejected before publication is 4. So reject, resubmit as new, reject, resubmit as new, reject, resubmit as new. Okay, now 9 months later it finally shows up. Right? So there's a little bit of game playing that's going on just to keep the numbers looking good, which I think is bad. But the other is they still give you that answer in like 6 months, reject, resubmit as new, and then you can say, yeah, no, based on those reviews, I'm going over here. Right? Even though they said I could resubmit, because they'll just say plain out reject as well. But if they say resubmit as new, you can still say maybe we should just go someplace else, because I don't think it's going to make it. So understand your commitment. Some conferences require, if you're submitting, that you will be reviewing. Okay, and it doesn't actually have to mean you. Generally, it means an author. If the journals have the conference has that, it's expected. So it might be your advisor is agreeing to review, but that's okay. You just have to understand what that requirement commitment is. But the other commitment is, in almost every conference, you are committing to attend and present the paper. In an IEEE conference, if you don't attend and present the paper, they should withdraw it and not publish the paper. It's a standing IEEE policy. Sometimes they'll let it go. If you have a visa issue, sometimes they'll say, okay, they applied for their visa in time, they didn't get it. NIPS was very explicit about it this year. If you have applied for your visa before October 1st, they will allow you to get a refund on your money and find somebody else to present it. But if the paper's not presented, it will not be published. Right? And you have to find somebody else to be your person if you can't go. Right? So that's a commitment you're making. And that's an important decision when you're looking at, it's a conference in Melbourne, Australia. You might be thinking, this is great. I get to go to Melbourne. And then you have to ask, and who's paying for it? Okay. The university will not pay just because you have a paper. There is, however, graduate school travel fellowships. If you get a paper published, right, you can apply for the CS department, the EC department, the graduate school. There's multiple pots of money to go after to try and get to travel to a conference. But have that conversation with your advisor, because those pots are pretty limited. So you want to, and your advisor, for example, I think the school has moved to, a faculty member is allowed to have 1 student per year. Otherwise, my lab could have more and take away from everyone else. So it's like you only get 1. So have that conversation. And there are also ways to reduce your costs. I've taken lots of students to conferences for free because I make them work, and I'm one of the organizers. So it's like free labor in exchange for registration and doing other things. Those opportunities at every conference, there are lots of volunteers. If you're an author, your chance of being a volunteer is higher, but lots of conferences will have local volunteers, right? So if there's a conference in your field, even if you've not submitted a paper, but there's a conference in Boulder or Denver or whatever, you might see if you can volunteer, because sometimes the authors don't want to work, right? If my students are an author, I won't make them work, right? If they're not an author and they want to go, they're working. It's the cost of going. But you can often volunteer to make stuff happen. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to open access, something I feel pretty strongly about. I've actually been a strong proponent within the computer vision field, which has been moved to open access in large part because of stuff me and a bunch of other people did. Open access simply means it's free to read. We feel that most of the work that goes into our community is our work. Right? We do all the reviewing of the papers for CVPR, right? Not IEEE. We don't mind that IEEE puts them in their thing and gets money out of it, but we want to make them freely available. So we invented the Computer Vision Foundation to have our own society that gives them away for free. And it was an ugly fight with IEEE, but we were successful. not everyone can do that. Some of our colleagues are trying to figure out how they can do it, and it's like they just don't have things set up right. But fully open access can be fully compatible with rigorous peer review. CVPR is one of the top conferences in our field, but all of our papers are open access. Everything we do is published, and you can get to it for free. And it doesn't necessarily mean the authors pay. Oh, there are lots of places, and that's the biggest danger. I, in fact, know very well, there's a few, but most places where the author pays, the open access isn't really a great model, right? It's really a for-profit publisher who's making money and saying, well, I got to get the money from someplace. If I'm not going to get it from the people downloading the paper, I'm going to get it from the author, okay? So IEEE has one. They call it IEEE Access. And IEEE Access is both supposed to be fast publishing, fast turnaround, and free. But you as an author have to pay $1,000 or $1,400. I can't remember the numbers, right? $1,400 is not that bad. If it gets more than that, it's ridiculous. If I think about what it would cost for me to go to a conference, $1,400 is less than my average cost of traveling to a conference. So it's actually not, it's like, well, in one case I have to travel, stay at the hotel, whatever. It's going to cost me to present a conference paper, even though there's no official publishing fee. There's a conference registration fee, the travel and all that. So at some level, it's, okay. Some journals are straight up free. Many journals have something in between where they can be open access if you pay extra, and otherwise it's closed access, and then you can make the decision as an author what you want to do with it. Those models so far have not been particularly good because people don't find them, right? They're all behind a paywall. More and more, so almost all IEEE conferences and a bunch of ACM conferences have adopted a in-between model. Copyright law is actually tricky. I wrote a paper. I have a copyright on this version of the paper. I make some edits. I submit a paper to IEEE for them to publish. They have a copyright on that paper, but I, as the original copyright holder on the original one, actually still own that copyright. Right? I can't use their version, but IEEE and ACM allow you to have on your personal website, and now both ACM and IEEE allow you to have on archive a copy of your paper as a preprint. It can't be the version they publish. It has to be the version before they got their version, right? Because that's the one you still own. Right? And then you can put that in there. So lots of places, and that I think has been a pretty good model. IEEE transactions and some journals allow that as well. Other journals are really strict about it. So when I talked about looking at like what the venue is, if the venue is one of those where they're not going to let you put it up on archive and they charge a ridiculous amount of money for the papers, then maybe that's not the best place for you because your work won't get out as widely known. It might actually be a fine place for somebody who's got a big enough name, but for you it might not be where you want to go. Open access journals can be low quality, high quality, just like subscription journals. The biggest difference is far more of the predatory journals are open access. And we're going to talk about predatory journals in just a second.
I'm sorry, I'm kind of missing. So what was you say there was an ideal method for funding open access websites?
I'm not sure there's an ideal one because they vary.
What do you think for that?
Well, obviously, I think the one I do is the best, right? But, so conferences make money, right? And good-sized conferences make lots of money. And so we, in 2011, I actually pulled CVPR away from IEEE. And they said, look, we'll run it on our own. You guys are not playing nice. We'll run it on our own. And I ran it, and UCCS was the official joint sponsor. We eventually let them play. Originally it was going to be just UCCS. But the conference makes so much money, we can run an open access website, right, and fund it, right? So we have funded our web server for our pages for the next 20 years, right? It's already prepaid, right? Azure was, actually now it's Azure, so before we were something else. But we have enough money to guarantee it will continue to be accessible. But all the papers are also on IEEE Explorer, right? So that's a model where long-term, IEEE Explorer will be there, they'll be maintaining it, but short-term, anybody in the world can get to our papers. The other thing about this is our papers are accessible on our website a week before the conference. IEEE, they will show up in IEEE Explorer about 2 months after the conference because of their slowness, right? We can move a little faster than that. But in this case, the community pays for it, but in an odd way. They all register to go to the conference. Conference makes enough money that pays for all of the open access. In fact, our biggest problem is the community Computer Vision Foundation actually now has $1 million in the bank. We're a nonprofit, and we're trying to figure out how to effectively use our money because Okay, we've more than covered the publication costs. Now what? So we're giving out scholarships and something like that. But there's lots of ways of doing it. But what I'm going to argue, and I'll go through some numbers in just a little bit, is you do want to worry about open access. Open access will significantly increase most likely increase the number of citations your papers get, because people can say. So how many of you were willing to pay for a paper when you were doing your browse and scan? You did? Oh. Okay. First, if you go through our library, you probably don't have to pay for much of anything because they're a pretty good library. But most people don't want to pay for it, right? So if you want your work to get out there, you want to make it as freely available as you can, trading a little bit of your time. So if you put it on archive, you can have a version of your paper that is out before the publication deadline, is accessible to people so they can build on it. And in a field where people are moving very fast, the ability to build on work that is going to show up at NIPS in December, but you can already get the paper and the code now, right, gives you an advantage that people are waiting until after NIPS to see it, right? So lots of fields are moving to this open access because it's accelerating the pace of research, okay? In fact, there are many people farther out on the open access limb than I am that believe, right, we shouldn't even be bothered with proceedings and publishing anymore. We should just be putting all of our papers in archive, okay? And if you haven't started looking through archive, there's just too much junk there for that to be a model I'm willing to live with. I want somebody to help filter it. Yeah, there's archive sanity, a few filters for it, but it's still a rough place to be. So can open access have prestige? So PLOS, right, is one of the largest science journals in the world, has a journal impact factor of over, it's actually 5 now, it was 4.3 a couple years ago. It's 10th in the Journal of Biology journals, and it's exclusively an open access journal. PLOS Biology is a mixed journal, also very good. As I said, CVPR went to open access in 2011, and we've actually we track our number of citations, right? Our impact has gone up significantly because it's been open access, right? We can actually track, are the people who are citing it at a place that has a library subscription? And we take it for granted. We have a library subscription here. The majority of institutions in India, right, don't have a library subscription to everything. Right? So the top schools, all the IISs do, the IITs do. Not all the IISs do, and after that, Pune and a bunch of other smaller schools don't have all high access. Because access to just IEEE score for a library is like $70,000 a year. That's a lot of money for access. Not every school wants to pay for it. So, this is a little bit older slide, but is it really a flash in the pan? There's lots of people that think open access won't work. I believe it will. Lots of other people believe it will. It will. It may not take over everything, but it's not going to go away either. There's what's called a directory of open access journals. It has a listing, this is actually 2 years ago, so I haven't checked it up, of over 10,000 fully open access peer-reviewed journals. Okay, I would say half of those are complete crap, but there's a list of all of them. Actually, it's only a list of those who choose to put them there, but it's very large, and it's growing. So, and as I said, most non-open access journals and conferences allow authors to deposit their things in an institutional repository. So lots of schools have what are called tech report repositories, but archive has really replaced that as the dominant place to put your papers. So any one of you can put a paper in an archive tomorrow. Right? You can upload anything that's not a copyright violation, and archive will accept it. It's not peer reviewed. That's the problem. You can upload anything you want. Your book report from last semester, you can take your journal entry from this week and make it. It's got a big bibliography. It'd be pretty good for some things out there. But so you're not doing it just for prestige. You really want to get to have your work be read and cited. Various research have shown that open access articles are good in good open access venues are cited 25 to 250% more than toll access journals. Right? So in fact, in the places, the nice thing about the journals that have free articles and not free articles, it made a good case study of what difference does it make. The free articles are still way more highly cited than the toll articles on average in the same journal. It's the same journal, same quality, it's just the authors decided to pay or not. And they use that as an argument for why you want to pay, but it still shows you some of the access advantages of what's going out there. Given the time, I'm actually going to sort of go through a little bit. You want your stuff to be free and make it easy to go away from that. So if I were to look at the citations to online articles compared to offline articles in the same venue, and this was an early paper in this in 2001, I would actually say the impact has gotten stronger. There's a greater push because now more people have access to open access, that the differentiation, in 2000 it was tricky. Maybe 10% of the things you were interested in or 5% of the things you were interested in were available freely online. Okay, so you often had to go through the paywall. And once you had to pay to be inside the paywall, you had access to everything inside the paywall, so it wasn't as big an issue. Now with so much on archive and everywhere else, more and more people are simply not paying to go through the wall ever because there's enough outside the wall now. And so it's becoming, I think, a bigger trend. So maybe I'm on to citations. Okay, so research impact. And citations is a measure of the research contributions to paper. Right? So we talked about H-index and whatever that's important. As you move forward, it will be an important part of your resume. When you go to write your resume, when you're applying for jobs, you'll probably be saying things like, here are my papers, here's the acceptance rate, and maybe here's the H-index of my paper, the number of citations if you have enough. If the number's not big enough, you don't mention that one, but you might mention the venues, right, to sort of say, yes, they were all in good venues. It's also useful for generating future research funding. Those who have published a lot are more likely to get more money, right, because they've demonstrated the output of their work. And it can help you as you try and move forward in terms of your career and research progress. A self-archive version, the archive version, your institutional library, is really a substitute for, is not a substitute for the original version. It's a supplement to it. In fact, very often one of the other nice things about an archive paper is you can actually fix the bugs. So in CVPR, we actually adopted an official policy where our online open access version will never be changed. But if you find a bug in your paper and you want to correct it, you actually submit to us an archive link where you put the corrected version, and we will point to that. So we'll say, here's the official version, corrected version here. Right? But we're keeping ours as the definition of archival. It has whatever's there. We don't want to keep changing. We're good or bad, archive, the results in the paper can change from week to week. Right? Now, the actually archive has been careful. You can't delete it. You can only add a new version. Right? So when you cite an archive paper, you should make sure you get the version. So we talked a little bit about citations. So this is a study from the UK. If I look at the number of citations to a paper, and this is in the year 2000, so this is old data, but the numbers are still sort of interesting, right? The number of papers, and maybe this one makes it a little bit easier, the number of papers that have less than 10 citations is most of the papers. In fact, the average number per paper is 10, and there are many papers, although you can't really see it as much here on this plot, right? There's probably 50 papers that had 0 citations, and this is after some period of time. And it's not necessarily particularly unique. If I go back to here, where's my mouse? Okay, and I will be picking on myself here. Where's my button? I'll go to my profile, right? If I look at it this way, I'll do it by year. If I look backwards, right, so here's papers from last year. So here's papers that have yet to receive any citations. Right? Here's some from 2017. Okay, here's a couple of 2016 papers. So I have papers. Here's some from 2014 with no citations. There's probably some going back to 2013, right? So it's not hard to have a paper that no one ever cites. It still got published. This is, in fact, conference paper, right? It can be, BTAS is a decent venue. It's a tier 2, tier 3-ish, right at the edge. Not great, but okay, right? But that paper never got cited. Now, one of the reasons that paper never got cited is because, like, 6 months later, we published a journal paper that was much more complete and bigger than that, which is another common thing. You can first publish a conference version and then a journal version, and sometimes the topic's just not that hot. So anyone who finds it, no one cites it in that first 6 months. It'll probably never get cited because now they're only going to cite the journal version of it after it comes out. And so you can play those kinds of games as well. But lots of papers have very few to no citations. In fact, most papers total are not cited at all. So if you were to go through, this is now from the archive, physics archive, in a bunch of subfields, right? But if I were to look at papers downloaded for the first 6 months and predict their citations after 2 years of publication, right, you get actually a pretty good correlation, 0.25 to 0.4, of what you can predict overall. And the more citations you get in the first 6 months, the more citations you're likely to get overall. It's not surprising that that's correlated. But the total number of citations is still an important metric. But since work often gets overturned by other work, getting those citations in the first 6 months is really important. This is sometimes really attributed to what we call the network effect, right? The people who are most connected get more citations than those who are less connected. So the earlier you can get your paper into that network of what's being cited, right, the farther it will go. And I can answer this a slightly different way. How many of you have searched in Google Scholar? Okay. How many of you have gone past the 10th page? Okay. Now, Google Scholar does not sort them exactly in citation order, but citation order is a big part of what Google Scholar uses for ordering. Right? So if your paper isn't there, people won't find it if they're searching in Google Scholar. Okay. Now, even if you search for 2018 papers, right, there's a period of time when your paper might be on the first page of Google Scholar because it's new enough and not much else has been cited. Right? So that's very important for you. So you're going to want to sort of go for the open access before your conference and build up that reputation before it gets going. There's different names out there. Gold open access, which is free to the reader, the author pays a fee. Platinum open access, which is free to the author and free to the reader, which is really what we do in CVPR. That's why I think it's better. It's like none of us, we're actually all paying in a different way, but no direct fee to the author. Delayed open access, which is actually how we started, where it was IEEE published it, and then we got to publish it later, and then we quickly moved away from that. And some journals have that. Like for the first year, it's paid, and then it's free. And then there's sort of the green open access, where it's really you do whatever the journal says, plus you put your paper in archive. The great thing about that is as long as it's not a violation of their policies, it's completely under your control. You can, in fact, have a paper. One of my students and I had a paper that had 14 citations before it was published. Right? It was in archive, and in fact, we only submitted it. We'd submitted and been rejected, submitted and been rejected. We're playing that game. And then we were ready to give up on it. It's like, look, it's got 14 citations. Let's just send it someplace that's a tier 2 venue, but at least it's published, right? Right now it's just an archive paper, but it's got 14 citations. Let's make it a real paper, then the citation will mean a little bit more. So archive can actually be pretty significant in where that goes. Unfortunately, some of the economic aspects of open access has caused a problem. Since people change from a subscription finance journal to author finance journals, there are some unanticipated aspects, which has really been where things have come up. Because now the business model focuses on authors as a revenue source. And the problem with that is now there's really a conflict of interest. The more authors and papers I get, the more money I make. Right? Where it used to be I had to have a good quality journal to get people to pay for the subscription to make money. So I had to maintain my quality. Now, as a for-profit publisher using open access, the authors are paying me. And the more of those I can get, right, the more money I can make. So those journals focus instead of quality on marketing and fast turnaround and trying to convince people to go with them. Not all subscription journals are good. Not all open access journals are bad, but you really need to understand the difference, because I will bet more than half of you have already received mail from a predatory publisher. Right? And if not, maybe it's only because you're new in the PhD program. After you publish your first paper, I guarantee you will receive mail from these predatory publishers, because one of the things they do is they get the lists of all the authors from other places, and then they send them email trying to convince them to go down this path. So I'm going to pick on this one, International Journal of Science and Advanced Technology. This is a pretty classic advertisement for what is assuredly a predatory journal. Does anyone notice any problems with this advertisement? Due dates. Submission due October 27th. Notification of acceptance, October 29th, right? So we have 2 days to read, review it, and say yes or no. Okay, and then when we're going to publish it, October 31st, right? So there's like, we're not even going to let you fix the grammar, right? It's not like the first round of draft editing. It's like, nope, we will take your paper and it will be published, right? And there are many. So anytime you see those kinds of things, those are red flags, right? They're really trying to pander to offer those. They generally do a bad job of reviewing, and sometimes they're completely fake reviews. They'll actually run through a grammar checker, which is like a $100 service to have your paper checked by Grammarly and send you back the results, right? But they're not really doing it. So if you get email inviting you to apply, okay, now if you get a generic email that says, like, here's a call for papers, and your name is not on it, that might be real. But if they use your name, it is guaranteed to be spam. No conference journal I know of uses your name to invite you. Right? Why? It's too much work, and it's a sign that we're trying to spam you. Right? So I haven't figured out why the predecessor journals haven't figured that out. By writing me by name is an instant sign, but they still do it. If you can't find them in Google Scholar under metrics, they're probably bad, probably predatory. But if they're really new, so if it's clearly the first whatever, the first year they've been in business, well, then it might be something you can't find it. The things I just showed you, unrealistic review timelines, right? Any review that's less than 2 or 3 weeks is completely bogus. 2 days, right? A week, it's probably still unrealistic. And if it's even a month and it's a journal, right? You should actually look at the journal and start trying to decide, is this really for real? In the conference space, the biggest ones here are extremely large multi-topic conferences. If the topic is talking about robotics and software engineering and underwater communications, that conference is almost assuredly garbage. Why? Because that's not a community, right? Now, if it's a bunch of software engineering venues, that could be okay. If it's a bunch of vision-related business, robotics, right? All the things related to the topic can be real, okay? But those large conferences, some of them are still bogus, even if they're all on one topic. So there's one that we've been trying to deal with called CVPR. Computer Vision, I can't remember but it's CVPRP, right? And it's a predatory conference trying to play off of CVPR. And we're fighting, trying to get them to be banned because their name is very close to ours, but copyright laws that currently we eventually have to take them to court, which is lots of money. So they ignored our cease and desist letters to go after it. But these big conferences, so a small conference, so as an organizer, I financial numbers of things, right? Small conferences with 200 people, the organizers, if they do it right, can make 50 to 75 grand. Large conferences, so the CVPR, depends on how we want to view it, we make between $1 and $2 million, right? That's a big conference, right? But there are bigger conferences that are 10,000 people, and the organizers can be making $5 or $6 million a year, right? And the more, so this is where it's a little bit of a same kind of problem you have with open access publishing. The more people that attend my conference, the more money I can make. Right? So there's a balance of what I want to do. I want to get lots of people. So having a multi-track conference where I accept all kinds of stuff, and I will tell you that it'll be indexed by Google Scholar. Wow. Right? Google Scholar is not hard to get indexed by. It doesn't mean it's indexed well, that it has any scores, right? Just it's in there, right? If I actually put it up on my personal website at the university, I can get Google Scholar to index it. Right? So if you know what you're doing, it sounds like it's indexed by something reasonable, but if it's not really indexed by Inspect or ISI or whatever, it's a little marginal where it's going to go. If they don't list who's the program committee of a conference, walk away. Good conferences always tell you who's in charge of those kinds of things. If it's an old topic with a new conference, this is almost always another bad sign. So if the topic is new, blockchains, right? Blockchain hasn't been around very long, so this year actually played its first blockchain conference. And there were a couple other first blockchain conferences this year. They might actually be good because blockchain simply hasn't been around long enough. But if I'm talking about, say, architecture, and somebody invents a new conference, it's probably not good. Why? Because there's an established architecture community, right? There's a venue for it already. Somebody starting a new one is either there's been a large political schism and the field is split, right? And there's now the Intel and the AMD conference, right? But generally, those kinds of things aren't happening. If you can't figure out how to contact anybody at the journal or at the conference, not a good sign, right? All the real ones will have a reputable way of contacting them. If there's a mention of a fee, but it's not clear, It may or may not be, because sometimes the websites are just broken for other reasons, but you definitely want to follow that up before you bother submitting. But most places that don't tell you what the author fee is are a scam. They're trying to debate you in. It's like, well, you can submit your paper for $375. Right? That sounds good. And then after 2 days later, send you the acceptance notification. Now it's $3,000 to publish the paper, right? And some of them recognize that people will not pay the $3,000, but that's okay. They already get $375, right? $375 for answering 2 emails. That's a good deal. You can find people who do that all day long. There's these things called false indexes. I'll talk about those in just a bit. If they don't actually have an ISSN or ISBN, which are the international publishing numbers associated with something, that's also a really bad sign. And it's sad because there's some conferences that list these numbers, but you can't actually verify them. So I've already seen various fake ones of these where they put on their website an ISBN. So I've now take the ISBN, type it into Google, like ISBN and a number, and Google, if it's a real one, will tell you what it is. If not, they'll say, I don't know what this number is, right? Or they'll actually, the ones I've seen fake are showing other conferences with similar but not matching names, like CVPRP. Jeff Beal, who's actually a faculty up at CU Denver, had this whole criterion. I'm given the time, I'm going to skip over this stuff, where he started this big push against these. He's a librarian and studies this stuff. He's actually stopped publishing his journal, his lists of these things, in part because people have been threatening. Some of these people take it very serious. There's a lot of fake stuff out there. Given the time, I'll sort of skip over that. People have been playing some games, especially with these predatory journals. You can play some games on Google Scholar. I decided to take the names off of these. But there have been at least one case where people played some games using these for-profit journals. Oddly enough, they were running them, so it was not even costly for them. They were making money by playing these games. And they would make, as editors, they actually made some editorial comments. They made people cite them. Right? So, which is another game to be played. It's like, this paper should cite these two. Right? You do that enough, you can get some citations built up. And then you can play some other games by making fake accounts, all citing your own papers. So any reputable place doesn't count your self-citations. Right? But they can only do that if they recognize that you're not Joseph Smith. Right? Sorry, yeah. You have to recognize that Joseph Smith is you, right? So whatever that. Right? So there have been some pushes to those. After some Beal brought up a particular case, you're going to sort of see the numbers here. This particular person went from having 1,700 citations to 150, right? Because Google went through and it removed a whole bunch of this self-citation leak from these games. But there are people who have been playing games. That same particular individual is back up to 1,000. Maybe because no one's watching him anymore, I decided to go look. He's backed up to over 1,000. And it's sort of interesting. If you look at his citation records, you can sort of see the year he was playing these games, right? So this is how many citations this person had in, whatever the mouse is. Well, you can see there's 2013, 2014, there's this giant spike, and then no one's citing the work again, right? And that's because they got tenure. They moved up through the ranks, play the game. They don't really care about it. There's been a whole bunch of things about people playing some games. So the one danger of Google Scholar, which the people who run Google Scholar are aware of, and they're trying to find some balanced way of addressing, is it is subject to gaming. You can go in. If I made every one of you write a paper and upload it to a public website on this university and cite me, I could have a bunch of citations, right? And that has been occurring within Google Scholar, where people are getting a bunch of citations by effectively signing homework and playing some games with university websites that make it look like they're a list of papers. Right? And so that's one way of playing games. There's some other ways. I'm not going to tell you all the ways to cheat, but they're out there. So predatory publishers damage science, in part because they are now being used by various groups with agendas to publish pseudoscience and then cite citations in reports and other articles arguing for their position. Right? If you really want to argue against global climate change, for example, and this is one that's right, there are 2 journals that will accept almost anything you want to publish that denies climate change. Right? And then you can cite them in your reports and other funding things, right? So they're predatory journals built around particular ideological bents now that are coming out, but they're journals. So how do you, it's free press, it's a journal, it goes through a review process, and oddly enough, some of those are actually far more serious than some of the other predatory, although they charge you to publish, they actually will make sure your paper is well written and some other things, so they'll prioritize some things. Most of these places also use some fake impact factors. So they'll tell you they have this journal impact factor. So the Cosmos impact factor or the International Institute for Research impact factors journals, as opposed to journal impact factor. Right? Just for dyslexics, they do mix it up for us. Any one of these are all fake things as far as we can tell. Right? They're all pretty bogus. And then they spend lots of money on advertising. So there's a couple guides in this link if you want to read more about predatory publishing. I mostly want to make sure you're aware of it so you don't get sucked in. I will tell you, early in my career, it wasn't quite the same as preparatory publishing, but in some ways it was. These were some weaker conferences that asked me to be an organizer. And I can tell you, it felt great the first time somebody said, we'd like you to help organize this conference. It's like, hey, they know who I am. This is great. I will help them organize a conference. Only recognized that this was really just so they could make money and they needed somebody to do all the work, right? That wasn't really a good conference. But I also want to put in a different direction. There are a number of things called author services companies. They provide such things as copy editing, pre-publication peer review, statistical methodology review, which probably isn't much of an issue for you, research promotion. That's one I find a little bit dubious. They will actually get more press for your articles. I get these I find somewhere on that borderline. Right? I get requests, so do we want to get our research work to have higher visibility? Just pay them $4,000 and they will market our research results. Some universities do it. I don't go down that path, but that's up to you. But most of these are not really predatory, although maybe the promotion ones are. But their quality varies. If you are not a native English speaker, or if you're a native English speaker and dyslexic, or have other problems, I strongly recommend that some services such as copy editing and proofreading are well worth the money. I spend it all the time. And if you don't know about it, well, I'll finish this and I'll come back to it. So this is something that it's an advantage to those of you who have money because you can pay to make your paper look better. Okay? There's another way to make your paper look better without paying a lot of money, but paying something else. What else might you do if you struggle with English or spelling or writing? So you can do two things, right? You can just get your peer reviews, right? I'll read yours, you read mine. Okay? That's definitely a place you want to go. Anything else you can do? So yeah, you can definitely pay proofreaders and English grammar people, right? So the Excel Center on campus, if you go to them with a paper, they will give you some feedback. They will not fix your grammar. They will not do direct editing, but many of them freelance on the side, right? And then there's plenty of online websites that will do some of that stuff. There's another approach, which is a little bit odd, but is also not that uncommon, which is you add a co-author. You actually add somebody who, and this is where an English major won't do it. I guarantee you will write a paper and English majors will be like, this sentence is completely wrong because they don't actually understand the nine nouns you use and the way they get combined, right? Or better, or worse yet, the sentence will actually be complete gobbledygook and they won't know it because they just dismiss it as, I don't know what this is, right? So getting an undergraduate or a graduate student in computer science who actually can understand what you're doing and getting them to help on your paper, and this can be a win-win, right? Their second author on a paper as an undergraduate, they're helping you, they're learning about research, and you're helping them learn about research, right? So it's a win-win. And then there's some tools, and if you don't, as I said, I have my own problems, but this is a tool, don't want to show that. So if you don't know of this tool called Grammarly, Grammar, LY, right? It's $99 a year. It will do all kinds of proofreading and editing for you, right? I use it, 12 times a day. I can't even remember. It's like anything I care about, I put through here. Emails, grading comments and whatever. I don't. But Grammarly, even in fact, now has. So Grammarly is integrated into my web. So there's a Chrome plugin. So if I were to actually go, but literally, if I'm typing in a text box, in various text boxes, it will tell me my spelling is wrong. It'll correct the grammar and do all kinds of things, right? Because I'm so bad at this stuff, I don't know. So it's like the squiggly red line on steroids. It'll like make word suggestions. But I will tell you another thing, which is it is not at all close to perfect. It will make suggestions that are wrong, and it will miss things that are there. So the last thing about proofreading I'm going to mention today is, and many of you may suffer. I'm dyslexic, so mine is a particularly bad form of this, so it might be more valuable for me. But I do very little proofreading. I do lots of proof listening. And you might be surprised, even if English is not your native language, you are more sensitive to hearing it sound wrong than you are to reading it. Because when you're reading, your eyes are doing one thing and your brain is acting differently. So if you feel you're good at listening, but you can't find problems when you're reading, try listening. And if you, I can show you outside of class how to listen to just about anything. But there's lots of tools that were designed largely for the blind, but are now accessible to all of us. But I can take pretty much anything on my screen, right, and get it to read out loud. Now, it's a little bit weird because sometimes they're reading like weird characters and you gotta, right? But in any Mac, in any Windows operating system, if it's on the screen, it'll read it to you with the right tool. And some of them are just better than others. So, and I do lots of listening on my phone, so that's even better. Why don't we take a 5-minute break, be back by 20 after, and we'll go on to the next topic.